Asia. I'm Gioia Serena Wang, and today I have the great honor of being joined by Olander, editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project, an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis initiative that examines China's engagement across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the broader developing world. Eric is an experienced journalist with more than 30 years of experience at leading global news organizations, including CNN, the Associated Press, and the BBC World Service. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Eric. It's such an honor and joy to have you.
Serena, it's so good to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
I'm super excited, and being a longtime fan of CGSP, I'm so glad that we're able to talk about these issues on the podcast.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to talk about kind of the consequences of the war in Iran, how China is responding, and especially and most importantly, what all of this means for countries in the global south. So just let me jump straight into it. Beijing has been actively really working the phone since the war began, right? Wang Yi has spoke with Iran's foreign minister 2 weeks ago. Special envoy Zhai Jun has been shuttling across the region. And just this morning, of course, according to CGSP, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian strongly condemned the Israeli airstrike. The Chinese government has stated they're kind of providing humanitarian assistance to Iran, Lebanon, and so on. So, Eric, how would you characterize China's response so far? What are the key interests and constraints that China's balancing in its response?
Overall, I think the war is being seen in China as, and again, this is going to sound kind of weird, but not the worst thing in the world to happen to China. Let's kind of start with the Iran-China relationship. China does buy about 12%, maybe 12 to 14% of its oil from Iran. That goes to these independent refineries in Shandong province known as the Teapot refiners. These are the independent refiners, so it's not the state-owned enterprises and the big refineries that use the Iranian oil. That 10% could easily be made up through purchases from Russia and Brazil, other suppliers. So I think the impact on China's oil supplies in the U.S. that we've been reading are vastly overstated. And remember that China is becoming increasingly self-reliant on energy. So it only imports about 20% of its energy. And so 80% of its energy is sourced domestically from coal, hydro, renewables, solar, and also it has electrified big parts of its automotive fleet. So it doesn't have the same impact that we're experiencing in other countries here in Southeast Asia, especially. So from an immediate impact point of view, there isn't the same type of crisis that we're seeing in other countries, especially in the U.S., where obviously gas prices are on the rise. I think, so when I say that, I think China's having a good war. In the one sense, I think most importantly, here's the U.S. once again getting bogged down in a Mideast war, something that Donald Trump and his supporters said would not happen. And the U.S. is depleting many of its stocks of weapons. They moved the THAAD interceptors, some of the THAAD interceptors from Korea, which were pointed towards China, which was something that China has long advocated for. This is something that is that they've really wanted. So they're seeing benefits here in Asia. They're seeing benefits in the Middle East as well. Obviously, stability is what China profits from the most. So this huge instability that we now have as a result of the war is detrimental to China's long-term interests. But there are real benefits in the sense of the geopolitical competition with the United States, because increasingly people look at the United States as the culprit in this, that there was not an imminent threat. The U.S. has not made that case to the world that there was an imminent threat to the United States and that this was a war of choice. And the United States, because they engaged in a war of choice at this particular time, has brought real inconvenience and pain to billions of people around the world. And that helps China in its case to say, listen, the U.S. is the destabilizing force. We are the stabilizing power. And in that sense, this has not been the worst thing for China.
If we look at, I guess, focus on geopolitical interests, Dr. John Calabrese says that although with pragmatic like oil imports is not a particular concern given its reliance isn't significantly on Iran, but it's concerning to see how China's major strategic allies such as Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, of course, are fragile across like various dimensions. I was wondering how you see kind of Iran within this context and within really China's seeking to develop its role as an alternative leader as the U.S.
Right, and this is and I read that article, and I generally agree with Calabrese on a lot of different things, but I think we have to be careful in assigning China the same role that the United States has, and this is a point that Evan Feigenbaum over at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has made, and a number of other analysts have made, that we are putting onto China a U.S. alliance structure paradigm that just does not exist. And so there's been a lot of talk in the U.S. about how China did not come to the defense of its so-called allies in Venezuela and Iran. And the reason why I say so-called is because China does not have allies other than with one country. The only alliance that China has is with North Korea. And there's a very particular reason why it has that with North Korea is because the concern the Chinese have is that should North Korea fall to the United States and South Korea, it could potentially bring U.S. troops right up to its border. And so it does not have the same type of alliance loyalty that the United States has, which is enshrined in law. The United States, through its treaty partners, has a legal obligation to protect different countries and to come to their aid who are treaty partners. China doesn't have that. And so China has these strategic interests with Iran and with Venezuela and with these various other countries, but they are not binding in any way. And so China has what I think, again, has been described by Feigenbaum, and I agree with it, as a diversified portfolio of interests. But just like in your stock portfolio, you have some stocks that are more important than other stocks. In the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, Iran is not really the most important. That is another misunderstanding and mischaracterization that we see in the US as well. When we look at the hierarchy of interest that China has in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are right at the top. When we look at the huge quantities of energy that the Chinese buy from Saudi Arabia, it dwarfs what they get from the Iranians. When we look at the diversity of interest that the Chinese have in the UAE, whether it's from oil and gas purchases, but also there's 400,000 Chinese who live there. There's deep investments in AI, in financial transactions, financial services, any number of different things that are going on through the UAE, vastly more important than what happens in Iran. Iran is useful for China as a bludgeon to hit the United States, as to push back on Israel, for example, but it is not an ally. And as such, we're seeing that China has this much more standoffish response to the war because at the end of the day, it's not going to expend vast amounts of political capital on a country that has use for it, but limited use for it. Again, you're seeing how in Beijing, Wang Yi met with the special envoy from the UAE. Wang Yi has been in touch with his counterparts in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. These are the real priorities for them in terms of their geopolitical interests.
Wow. Yeah, really, as you said, Feigenbaum's idea of the diversification of interest and really the nuance within this, because there could be, rhetorical alliances with Iran, but when you look at the pragmatism, right, strategic interests are much more different.
That's right. So the way that I describe the Chinese approach is pragmatic realism. It's an intensely pragmatic approach. China's core security interests are not in Latin America or in the Middle East. They are in its near abroad, here in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, along the First Island chain, in the territorial disputes that it has along its periphery, whether it's with India or disputed islands with Japan or the South China Sea. Those are the core security interests. What's happening in Iran and Venezuela and other parts of the world are important to be sure, but they are not core security interests. And so I think it's really important to make these distinctions on what is a top tier priority for China and what is a fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh level priority for China. We tend to conflate them all up into one, and that's a mistake.
But what about the interest of kind of, portraying itself as an alternative leader to the world? Like, is that an interest at all? Is that a misconception, or
It
is
is
that
it is
complicated?
a slight misconception. There's some truth to it that China does see the US-led and the European-led international system as, in many ways, objectionable. But China is not Russia. And this is another problem that I have with the discourse in the US is that oftentimes Russia and China are used interchangeably in Washington as some type of axis that wants to entirely topple the Western-led international system. Let's not forget that the Chinese have become incredibly rich and find the Western led system to be very, very useful and practical for them. The Chinese Navy is not going to patrol the Eastern Mediterranean. The Chinese Navy is not going to patrol the South Atlantic. The Chinese Navy is not going to provide the kind of public goods that the United States has done for decades. That is not what China is going to do. It has no precedent for that in its foreign policy, nor have they ever expressed a desire to do that. The Chinese, though, feel frustrated, and for many years they felt this way, that the US led international system did not accommodate them as the world's second largest economy. This was most evident when the Chinese approached the Obama administration and asked for a recalibration of their standing in the Bretton Woods institutions. And the, the share ownership in things like the IMF and the World Bank are supposed to go based on the size of the economy. Yet, Japan is the second largest shareholder behind the United States in the World Bank. That doesn't make any sense to the Chinese. They said, well, we should be the second largest shareholder. The Obama administration said, nope, because we don't want you to change these institutions that historically have been run by the US and Europeans. And so the Chinese went out and then started the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative. That does not mean they want to overthrow the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, China is very active in its membership there. But it does want more room to maneuver in a world that they don't feel that the U.S. is giving them the space to do that in the current international system. That's number one. Number two, there is a sense that the G7 and the IMF and the World Bank, remember the IMF is automatically assigned the presidency by a European. The World Bank is automatically assigned the presidency by an American. This is a deeply out of date system. And so the Chinese see an opportunity here to be able to tell a story to the rest of the world to say, we are creating forums, institutions, and parallel international governance architectures that are inclusive of you. Because at the end of the day, when you have, say, a G7 country, when their ambassador goes to pick a country, Togo, Guyana, any country in the global south, and the foreign minister meets with that ambassador the first day and says, what have you got to offer? And that ambassador from a G7 country says, well, we want to preserve the rules-based international order. That's what we think is best. Well, that's a backwards-looking vision. That's saying we want to protect the world the way it was. And the problem with that is that for many countries in the global south, the way it was has not been very good. I'm sitting here in Vietnam. The post-war period after 1945 was a very turbulent period in Southeast Asia and in Vietnam. Wars with the French, wars with the Americans, Cambodia, the Chinese. So this idea that the old system is the way to go is something that doesn't really find a lot of appeal in many developing countries. Meanwhile, the Chinese ambassador shows up in Togo, and the foreign minister says, what have you got? They said, well, listen, we've got the Belt and Road, we've got the Global Development Initiative, we've got the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global AI Initiative, we've got the New Development Bank, we've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that now has dozens of African members. All of it, we want you to be a part of. Now, the Togolese foreign minister may go, yeah, I don't know how many tangible benefits I'm going to get it, but I like the sound that I am invited to be a part of this. And that is the major contrast between what we see coming from the Chinese and what we see coming from the US, Europe, and Japan, where there is not a forward vision that is inclusive of 160 plus countries.
I guess transition to the kind of next section of the podcast I wanted to talk about, which is really the global south perspective. But this part focuses on the consequences. So you've like highlighted in your podcast as well as, of course, analysis on CGSP that while oil gets kind of the headlines, right, fertilizer and fuel disruptions matter more or may matter more for the global south.
And including China, too.
Yes, because China's halted some fuel exports and urea and sulfur prices have surged right ahead of planting season, hitting major importers such as like Brazil and Mexico very hard. And the Philippines have also switched to a 4-day work week to conserve fuel. I'm curious whether you think this war is kind of accelerating a global south push to potentially strengthen and diversify their supply chains away from China or within the global south, or is it unrealistic given its the fundamental dependence on China's scale within?
So for a lot of us sitting here in developing countries, poor developing countries like Vietnam, where I am at, there is a sense of, uh-oh, here we go again. So during the pandemic, we saw what humanity is really made of. And what humanity is really made of is that the rich people get to take as much as they want for them. And they grabbed all the vaccines. Not only did they grab the vaccines, they grabbed 5, 6, 7, 8 times the quantity of vaccines that they actually needed just as insurance, while billions of people were on the precipice of, back then we didn't know what this pandemic was going to do. But at the time, this thing could have wiped out hundreds of millions of people, if not more. That was our assumption at that time. While Canada, Norway, France, the United States had so many vaccines, they didn't even know what to do with it. The United States was opening up at CVS packets of vaccines. They didn't even use them all, they threw them away. They were vaccinating pets in the US before they were vaccinating humans here in Southeast Asia. So there is this sense of like, oh no, yep, we've seen this before. These guys are going to go and take care of themselves with oil, gas, and whatnot. And we're going to have to figure it out. So look at Laos and Cambodia in the past couple of days. The gas lines are just huge. It's basically gone. There's no reserves. This idea of being able to move supply lines and supply chains is a luxury for the poorest countries in the world. They take what they can get. You don't have the options. You don't have the market power to be able to say, I'm going to go here and go there. And so right now in Vietnam, the concern is that we've run out of jet fuel, or we're about to run out of jet fuel, because they rely on imports for refined jet fuel. They don't have the refining capacity or the storage capacity here. So this, I don't think, is going to raise the questions of should we be too reliant on China or on someone else. They just need access to these resources, full stop. And there is a feeling that they're going to get screwed yet again because the rich eat first, always. And so this is what happened in the Ukraine war. So remember in the Ukraine war, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the United States had been lecturing African countries in the Obama and Biden administrations to decarbonize, to transition to green energy. And as soon as, within days of the invasion, former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken went to Algeria and pleaded for Algeria to divert fossil fuels to Europe. So all of a sudden, when the white people run into problems, fossil fuels are perfectly fine. But when other people need it, we need to decarbonize and to transition to green energy. This is the hypocrisy of the whole system that undermines Western credibility and feeds into the Chinese narrative that says, these guys don't give a crap about you. They only will take for them. Whether that's true or not, that's a different story, but that is how the narrative is being leveraged by the Chinese. So this question of whether developing countries, particularly the poorest countries, are going to be concerned about over-reliance on China, no. They're just talking about how do I get through today, and then I need to worry about tomorrow. And if the Chinese are going to come in and going to help them do that, great. If they're not, fine. We're going to go somewhere else. If the Russians come in and do it, great. If they don't do it, we'll go somewhere else. Again, this is ultimate pragmatic realism.
Mhm. Thank you so much for bringing up such an important point and really the misconception about choice, and really the misconception I have of applying strategic choice to developing countries. Well,
Yeah.
because this kind of connects to my next question. Potentially, it's an opportunity of within this context. So, Iran offered a protected passage through the Strait of Hormuz to South Africa and BRICS nations this morning. And as is written, of course, on China and the Global South's analysis, access to maritime shipping routes are becoming more contingent upon geopolitical alignment. So, what do you think really are the implications of this to the global order? Are maritime choke points increasingly are going to be used in the future as leverage points in great power competition? And what does this mean for developing countries who have limited choice?
Well, it's not only maritime choke points that are going to be the concern. Obviously, this is what puts Taiwan front and center and everything, because some 80 to 90% of the highest end chips come from just one island. And so we see supply chain choke points as well, beyond just maritime choke points, going to be vulnerable. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is that both the United States and China are open to weaponizing those supply chains. And so that is the new reality that we are going to face. And so that's going to drive more self-reliance. And that's certainly when we saw the 15th five-year plan come out of China, the key kind of theme that take away from all of this is self-reliance. And I think what the Chinese are seeing in the world today is that feeling is validated. Donald Trump, to his credit, is talking about self-reliance as well. And the Republicans have been talking about how it doesn't make any sense for the United States to be reliant on China for precursors for pharmaceuticals, for any number for precursors for pesticides and farm equipment and chemicals, and any number of products that the United States has outsourced around the world because of the idea of globalization in the 20, 30-year ago period is basically dying right now. So these ideas of self-reliance is going to mitigate against maritime and supply chain choke points. I don't know if that's going to be possible to do. These supply chains took decades to build. They will take decades to unwind as well. New technologies may make that different. But at the end of the day, when we look at data centers, for example, they're still highly reliant on a lot of Chinese tech that goes into data centers and automation. And so this is not going to be easy to untangle these global supply chains that are subject now to be weaponized in ways that we hadn't foreseen 5, 10 years ago. So I think this is basically a precursor to what your generation has to start thinking about, which is if I and I'm advising my son, who's 17, about what to study and what to think about, and I said I'm just giving him recommendations. Supply chain management is going to be a very, very, very interesting business to be in the next generation, because how do you get products and people from point A to point B without by bypassing those choke points? And now we have this big problem. For example, the Gulf is shut down to air travel. And Sri Lanka is putting itself up now as maybe a hub for Etihad and for Emirates to relocate their hub for the foreseeable future. Things we could never have imagined, a year ago, that maybe Emirates and Etihad, the idea of having a hub and spoke network for an entire airline doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe we're going to see 4 or 5 hubs for these Gulf airlines now, because when one shuts down, their whole operation doesn't have to shut down as it is right now. So this is going to be one of the most interesting things that we see is, again, future of supply chain management in order to mitigate against choke points. And here in Southeast Asia, of course, the big choke point that everybody thinks about is the Strait of Malacca. And so if you're sitting in Singapore and you're seeing that the Iranians are bombing the crap out of Dubai and the Emirates because they are right at the Strait of Hormuz, Singapore all of a sudden is getting like, oh my goodness, maybe we might, in the future of a US-China conflict in the Western Pacific, Singapore could be vulnerable now to the same way that Dubai is being hit, or Qatar is being hit, or Abu Dhabi is being hit and whatnot.
That's really fascinating to really starting to rethink everyone's positioning, and the interconnections of really like economies and
Yeah.
and supply chains around the world. And I guess just a transition to the next section, which is where does the global south fit into all of this, right? So a recent piece by the CFR by Ebenezer Obadari points out that African countries have largely refused to kind of side with Iran. There's certain African countries such as South Africa that have condemned the missile attacks, but in a very not a direct and explicit way. And he's highlighted how Iran, even though it's positioned itself as the center of an axis of resistance in the global south, when it matters currently, the coalition didn't necessarily hold. In Latin America, we kind of see a parallel dynamic. Leaders such as Milei and Cas, who have gone kind of all in on a kind of alignment with Washington, are simultaneously grappling with their economic dependence on China, which, as one analyst from the Inter-American Dialogue, said was non-negotiable. But they also lack the political space to say so openly while attending Trump's kind of Shield of America summit, right? So does all of this context tell us about kind of global South countries' position in this context?
So this came up in the Ukraine-Russia war as well, where a lot of global South countries just said, this isn't my fight. I don't have a say in this. And there's a concern, if you are a policymaker or a strategist in a developing country far, far away from these battlefields, you have to think pragmatically about, okay, if I choose side A and then side B is pissed off at me, when the music stops, maybe side B wins and side A loses. So now I'm going to take a repercussion from side B, who I picked against. And so the question is, if, again, pragmatic realism. If you are in Vietnam and you see Russia, Ukraine, you don't have much impact from this war on day to day life here, okay, this far away. Iran is a slightly different story because obviously everybody's dependent on oil. But at the same time, you see these countries throughout the global south, and here in Asia, it's really a good case study for this. They're highly dependent on the United States as well. So taking a hostile position to the United States does not serve your long term interests. This ability for ideological purity and to be sanctimonious on the world stage is a luxury that only the richest countries in the world can afford. This is not a privilege that middle to small power countries can engage in. Because at the end of the day, they are vulnerable to the whims of the more powerful countries. That is the nature of the way the international system operates. So their goal is to try and keep their head down for the most part as much as possible, and then to move in big groups when there's cover. So we saw in the Israel-Palestine and the Israel-Gaza issue, most developing countries, pretty much every developing country, sided against the United States. But there is strength in numbers on some of these issues. Now, what's interesting to watch in the context of the Iran war is the BRICS. The BRICS was put forward as this bulwark against the US in particular, and as this coalition that was going to challenge the Western-led international system. And many of my critics on YouTube and my haters on YouTube, they will say, you don't get the BRICS. The BRICS was all about economics. And like, that's complete BS, because when you look at the communiques that came out of all the BRICS summits, they talk about security, they talk about geopolitics, they talk about climate change, they talk about any number of different things. Here we have a BRICS member, a full-fledged member, coming under direct military attack by the United States. And what did the BRICS as a group do? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, one of the things that we tracked at CGSP was that in a 24-hour period, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a statement on the Iran war, and India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar also gave one, and they were completely divergent. I mean, we're talking totally divergent. Remember that India has really close ties with Israel. So India is not going to come out very strongly against the United States. And India is also a security partner in the Quad with the United States. So India has got its own portfolio of interests, and pushing hard against the U.S. and Israel is not part of it. This is one of the reasons why in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization statement that came out last June in opposition to criticize the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, India was not even present. India had to come out the following day to issue a statement saying, whoa, guys, they did this without us. And I think that shows you the fractures and the limitations of some of these Chinese-initiated alternative governance organizations that are really more about convening to express grievance about the system, but not necessarily to do anything. Now, a lot of people say, well, you're denigrating the BRICS, and I say, I'm just saying the BRICS. There's not a lot of there. However, grievance in today's politics is an extremely powerful force. Grievance is what brought Nigel Farage to power in Britain and the UKIP forces and the Brexit. Grievance is what brought MAGA and Trump to power in the United States. Grievance is a powerful force. So if the BRICS is really nothing more than just a grievance session, then that is useful. But it is not an entity that is going to confront the United States or the major powers in situations like this, where one of its own members is coming under attack. And you're seeing the Indians right now who are working behind the scenes to try and muster up a joint statement coming out of the BRICS, and they're finding it incredibly difficult.
So, we see like tangibly in like in terms of ideology and the actions that come with BRICS because of internal fragmentation, as you said, there cannot really be like tangible consequences, right? But
Right.
another concept you've highlighted in the podcast is pragmatic realism. So does, for example, Chinese offerings of infrastructure loans and increasingly like open access to trade, like does this make up a little bit for the lack of kind of tangible, if that makes sense, like a tangible action with related to regional conflict?
Uh, no, not really. Those are, I think, are very separate tracks of things that don't necessarily cross. Um, I think that what China's doing now by, for example, offering duty-free access to 53 African countries, and also China extending, for example, it's going to provide energy assistance to Southeast Asia now to mitigate some of the impacts of the war. Those are about Chinese interests. They're not about the BRICS. They're not aligned necessarily with what India's doing or Russia's doing or South Africa's doing. The foreign ministers are not on weekly calls to coordinate and align their positions. There is no joint statements that are coming out. There is no resolution that's coming out. There's no collective buying of oil, for example, to help other BRICS members. None of that coordination is happening. Everybody right now is in a kind of much more narrow, I'm looking out for my own, I'm not worrying about my coalition partners or the bloc partners in the BRICS. And this could be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It can be any number of these groups. So I think what the Chinese are doing right now, and what they've always done, is pursue a much more narrow, domestically driven foreign policy. That is, make China great again. It's a MACA foreign policy, not a MAGA foreign policy. And that's what they've always done. They've always focused on their needs first, which again, if you look at realpolitik, that is perfectly aligned with the classic definition of realpolitik, that countries will pursue much more narrowly defined interests that are bound by their own domestic politics for the most part. And I think China is very much aligned with that. So that would then limit China making any type of concessions for India, for example. I mean, eh, even though there's been a rapprochement between India and China and tensions have cooled quite a bit over the past 18 months, there is still a high level of distrust between these two Asian powers. They are no longer necessarily at each other's throats with knives, but there's still tens of thousands of troops forward deployed in the Himalayas along the line of actual control. They did not pull all those troops back. They have not taken the heavy guns back. They have not taken the air bases back. So there's been improvement. It's better today than it was. There are ambassadors in each other's countries. There's journalists in each other's countries. Students are going back and forth. There's going to be more trade. More investment agreements are being laid out right now, but still very, very high levels of distrust between Indians and Chinese on their foreign policies. And so I don't foresee that the Chinese or the Indians would ever make a compromise or concession in the name of the coalition rather than their own narrow interests.
That's fascinating to really see all the different kind of dimensions that global South countries, as well as the leaders, obviously, suppose in India and China have to consider, and the intersections between their domestic politics and long-term border grievances and their supposed long-term like
Yeah.
broader
It's a mix
goals.
of these grievances towards the West, which is great for sound bites, but at the same time, they have to provide results for their people, or else they're going to face domestic problems, even in communist countries, authoritarian countries like China, where there are still domestic politics, there are still special interests. Public opinion does matter. And so I think there's a misreading of the situation by a lot of people in the US who think, well, Xi Jinping gets to wake up and every day do whatever he wants. He has to maneuver through a massive bureaucracy. He's got to manage politics, and he's got a public that is frustrated with the slow growth of the economy, that is frustrated with opportunities, that is frustrated by the fact that cost of living is going up. And these are immediate pressures on the political actors in China who he has to respond to as well. So he doesn't have the type of maneuverability that I think a lot of people give him credit for in the West.
And yeah, I guess just to really ended this in a very nuanced way to really kind of set our listeners up for the future, I guess, where do you see all of this heading, right? If we situate, the Iran war, if we situate the fraying of a rules-based order with an, increasing transactionalist US administration, right? How do you think this reshapes China's influence in the global South? And does it ultimately strengthen its pitch to the developing world, or does it kind of expose the limits China and India can have to its partners?
So I think about this a lot. I think the world, I mean, and again, this is, and again, it's still fresh in my head, so I'm putting my words together as we put this out. But I'm trying to process the damage that the United States has done to the world with this war. And again, Iran is complicit in this as well. So this is not a simple binary. The U.S. did something bad, Iran did something, is the victim here and whatnot. It's not that clean. Okay, but the destruction of the energy infrastructure that the world has come to rely on, that took, again, decades to build, and is now, big parts of it are in ruins, are literally in ashes, is going to restructure power in the world. And I can see it happening right here on the streets of Ho Chi Minh City, where demand for electric mobility is skyrocketing now. And I think this is going to accelerate the transition to electric powered mobility in much of the world where they can. That is going to play right into China's hands, because who dominates the electric mobility supply chain? And the reason why I'm saying electric mobility, by the way, and not electric vehicles, in the US, we talk about EVs only. But in the global South, we're talking about mobility, which is bikes, scooters, tricycles, buses, carts, any number of ways of putting a motor on a wheel. And if it used to be powered by a two-stroke engine, it's now being powered by a battery that usually has nickel, cobalt, and manganese and lithium in it. And a lot of that nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium is either extracted by Chinese mining companies, and if it's not extracted by Chinese mining companies, it's refined or processed by Chinese mining companies. That supply chain, the United States has no ability to challenge right now in any meaningful way, or Europe either, or Japan. So we are accelerating a shift into Chinese dominance of key technological areas. So if you are countries now that are starving for electricity because your oil and gas deliveries have gone down, you are going to look to solar. Regrettably, you're also going to shift back quickly into coal. So my guess is that a lot of the climate objectives are going to be thrown out the window now. And so countries around the world that had put coal away and tried to do transitions are going to be dusting off their coal plants and firing up the coal-fired power plants, because we need lights and air conditioning here in Vietnam and other places. And at the end of the day, if coal's going to do it and burn a hole, the people in Southeast Asia and Africa will tell you in Washington to go F off when you say don't use coal, because in Southeast Asia, they account for about 6% of global emissions that contribute to climate change. And in Africa, it's less than 3%. Okay? This is your problem, not our problem. Our problem is right now is to make sure that the lights turn on and industry can run and that we can have a functioning society. In terms of blowing a hole in the climate, that is something that many people in the global South say, that is something that you did and you need to fix. And you still continue to emit the majority of pollutants. And obviously, the United States now has completely abandoned all of that. So any moralizing or sanctimonious language coming from the West is completely dismissed. So I think the world that we're going into is going to be dirtier. I think it's going to be vastly more violent and turbulent. I think this question of supply chain weaponization that we talked about earlier is the new reality that we're going to have to confront. And think about it from your generation, Serena, okay? In the past 6 years, your generation has dealt with a pandemic, a war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and now a war in Iran, okay? This is what we're going to be dealing with for the rest of your life, okay? And we got data this week in Vietnam, and this is the same in many other places, that Vietnam is aging too fast now. And so just like we said in China for a long time, that China's going to get old before it gets rich, That's not just a Chinese problem. That's even a problem in the global South. So when you look at where Vietnam is in terms of its median age, and you compare that to where Korea was with its median age and the wealth that it had per capita, Vietnam is far behind. And so a number of countries are facing this. So we have this demographic crisis, we have the climate crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have a great power rival, we've got the problems that come with AI. And let's not talk about, how massively data hungry, energy hungry, sorry, massively energy hungry data centers, what impact this is going to have on them. Are we going to start diverting power away from civilian sectors to feed AI data centers because we've got power shortages in many parts of the world? So our reliance on AI is only going to exacerbate power shortages. So this is this is I don't have a happy story. There's no two ways about it. I don't think there's any point in sugarcoating it.
This is the last question, I promise. Into like the kind of nation state level, right? Like what should global South countries and in the extreme diversity and complexity that term obviously entails, right? Do. For example, I know that the head of research, Cobus van Staden at CGSP, has written about African countries like proposing a united, clear front in FOCAC, right? Is this like
That's
a
fantasy. I mean, I mean, I respect Cobus for saying that, but it has always been fantasy that countries work together as a bloc. Goes back to the same problem we talked about with the BRICS, because countries are in this defensive mode right now of I need to take care of my people. And bear in mind that a lot of leaders are like Donald Trump, where their people are not the primary focus. Regime survival, in many cases, is a priority over caring for your own people. So we shouldn't assume that elites in many countries, including the United States, have the interest in the welfare of their people as the paramount concern. The social contract that you talked about in China, that social contract is very strong. It's very weak in many countries, not just in the global South, but obviously even in the US as well. So that makes it difficult because sometimes we have countries that are genuinely concerned about the welfare of their people, and they will want to seek to work as blocs and coalitions. And again, there is strength in numbers. You know, the old metaphor where they say a finger is weak, but a fist is strong. Yes, that sounds great, but that requires a lot of alignment of interests and policies and engagements and whatnot that a lot of countries just don't have. And then you have this dynamic in Africa or in South America where you've got small countries. So if you're a Botswana and you have to then accommodate to a Nigeria or a South Africa, what we've seen in Africa is that for the most part, the big powers tend to set the rules for the smaller powers. That is the way it is globally, and it's the way it is regionally. And so there's a lot of frustration on small powers that say, well, listen, I don't want to follow the lead of what's good for Nigeria because what's good for Nigeria is not necessarily what's good for Botswana or Gabon. And that makes sense. There's logic to that. So this is going to be a very, very difficult time for small powers, but really at the end of the day, it's going to be hard for poor and weak powers. So you can have large countries like Nigeria, but that have weak governance, and therefore they are not able to project power relative to their size that they ultimately should have. I mean, Nigeria is a huge country. Ironically, Nigeria might actually come out of this whole situation stronger if they can start to refine more energy and if they can start to supply the African market. And again, same thing with Angola. We're hoping that this will provide new opportunities. You know, the Chinese have the word for crisis is danger and opportunity, the two characters that put together.
危机 yeah, 危
Weiji,
机.
and
Mhm.
so, 危险 and 机会. And so I think that applies to many countries, particularly in the global South and in the developing world, where there are going to be opportunities here. So Vietnam, for example, is reaching out to Angola to be an alternative gas supplier. That could be whole new opportunities for Angola to diversify beyond just supplying the Chinese market where it puts about 80% of its oil. So again, things are going to come out of this that are unexpected, but I think for the most part, it's going to be very, very rough going for them.
Mhm. Well, we got a little bit of the optimism in the end, which
A little
I guess
tiny bit.
it's yeah, a little bit, but Thank you so much for really giving your time to today's podcast and really highlighting such nuanced perspectives, not only about China, but within the global south, like the importance of underground electric mobility, which is vastly undercovered in existing research, the importance or the misconceptions around choice and really like that's strategic choice and strategic supply chain realliances are frequently talked about, but never elaborated in terms of the accessibility to countries in the global south. So thank you very much for really such a fascinating conversation, and
Yeah.
hopefully to
Wonderful.
get
Well,
you again
thank you for
soon.
inviting me. Thank you, and I'm really just happy to have this conversation with the Georgetown community.
Of course, and I'm sure that our listeners will find this a very fruitful discussion. We hope to have you here in the future as well, hopefully in
Yeah.
a better light. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Serena.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed and that you'll join us in tracking emerging events across Asia.